Summoning. Written and read by David Longhorn. "Mind if I leave some flyers here?" asked Derek. The barmaid looked uncertain. She glanced at the little stand at the end of the bar. It contained a handful of sad-looking leaflets advertising gigs, fringe theatre productions and the like. "I'll have to ask the boss. What's it about?" Derek handed her a leaflet, and she turned it over, scanning the print. A frown turned into a smile, and she handed it back. "I don't think there'll be a problem, what with it just being music. It looks really interesting. Just leave some with me, and I'll persuade Harry to put them on display." Derek thanked her and left. He'd managed to get rid of most of the flyers. Not that there'd been very many in the first place. Apparently they were too old-fashioned and seldom got much reaction. There was some hope that their website and YouTube channel would attract more interest. They'd all put so much into staging a work by the city's only composer, but no tickets had been sold as yet. As he hesitated under the glowing pub sign, he glimpsed his reflection in the window. A thin, dark-eyed man, head-shaven because of early male-pattern baldness. He looked a decade older than his 33 years, and his posture was poor. Uriah Heep, he thought, bit of a toady, too eager to please. Somebody else evidently thought he was a poor specimen. He heard a snicker of amusement quite close by. But there was nobody within 6 or 7 yards, just a young woman pushing a baby in a buggy, smiling down and talking to the infant. Perhaps she'd been doing a silly voice. He looked back at the window, straightened his spine, threw back his shoulders. The mother pushed the buggy past him. The snickering came again. Out of the corner of his eye he glimpsed a hint of shadow that was surely not cast by him or the young woman. He stared down. There was no shadow. His peripheral vision, never very good, had tricked him. He shoved the last dozen or so flyers into his backpack and strode on, uptown, towards the concert hall. He came to a crossing, pushed the button, waited patiently. He sensed someone come up and stand just behind him, a little too close to his left shoulder. He caught their reflection in the side of a passing bus. It was distorted, a grotesquely tall shape that seemed to be crooked, far more so than the image of himself in the silver paintwork. Green lights told him to walk. He glanced over his shoulder as he stepped off the curb and nearly stumbled. Nobody was behind him. Seeing things, he thought. Lack of sleep can do that. I can't work all day and then do this every evening. But he was committed now, talked into joining the choral society by a pretty work colleague. It had been pure random chance, an office party when somebody had brought in a karaoke machine. Derek, unused to drink of any kind, had downed 3 glasses of cheap vino and attempted Barry Manilow's classic Bermuda Triangle. This had prompted some ironic cheers. But Deirdre, head of the sales team, had told him he had a good voice. "Join my little group," she'd said. "We meet up once a week to sing. Nothing fancy, just regular people enjoying music and raising their spirits." That had been just over 8 months ago. Now Derek was the group's unofficial publicist, fixer, administrator, general gopher. Deirdre, the society's president, only had to hint at a task, and Derek couldn't help himself. If the others noticed, none said anything. But then, when they weren't singing or talking about music, the rest of the members were quite standoffish. It was a class thing. Most of them seemed to come from old money and had vaguely defined jobs or simply didn't work at all. One of the wealthy jobless ones, Sebastian, was waiting outside the concert hall when Derek got there. I managed to place most of the flyers," he said, a little too eagerly. Sebastian, a white-haired, smug-looking man of around 60, smiled indulgently. "Well done, lad. You're an asset to our little clan." He held up a bunch of keys. "Now, let's scope out the venue, shall we? Lots to do in preparation." Inside the concert hall seemed quiet as the grave. It was an odd comparison, but it forced itself onto Derek. The empty stage, the rows of seats upholstered in plush maroon velvet, recalled a funeral parlour. It was a relief when Sebastian called out for Deirdre, and she replied from somewhere in the orchestra pit. "Derek's here," the white-haired man added. "Oh, good." Deirdre's head appeared over the edge of the pit. She had an aquiline, aristocratic face and bobbed auburn hair. She was around 40 and treated Derek as a little brother. It was frustrating, but he consoled himself that she'd apparently no significant other in her life. He had once tentatively asked her if she lived alone. She had replied, "Alone except for Daubeny." Not for the first time, as the others discussed acoustics and related matters, Derek reflected on the jealousy he felt for the obscure composer. It was hardly reasonable, given that Alaric Daubeny was dead, and had been for decades. He looked up at the stage where the society's members would soon be rehearsing the man's last and strangest work. Perhaps if he distinguished himself, Deirdre would see him less as a colleague and friend, and more as a potential— "Derek?" Deirdre had been speaking to him. Flustered, he stammered out something about the atmosphere of the place being a little overwhelming. She laid a pale, slender hand on his arm, and he quivered slightly. "Don't be nervous. You'll be fine. Now let's do a little sound check, shall we?" Derek loved tinkering with gadgets and had learned a lot online about microphones, speakers, amplifiers, and so forth. That said, as he examined the impressive array of equipment, he wondered what the audience would make of the odder aspects of the concert. Daubeny's hitherto unperformed piece, enigmatically entitled Summoning, included infrasonic chords. Derek understood that infrasound, frequencies too low for the human ear, still affected people, often causing unease. It was clever, but he wondered if the audience would appreciate it, assuming that anyone turned up. How are ticket sales?" he asked Deirdre, after checking the amps were all safely wired up. "Oh, it's been very quiet," she said airily, "but there'll be a small piece in the local paper, so that might help." Derek was unsure whether to be disappointed or relieved. He relished the idea of impressing Deirdre in front of a packed house, but the thought of hundreds of people watching him on stage was terrifying. He went back to focusing on the mundane tasks that always seemed to devolve to him. It was the best way to suppress his self-doubt. His work took him into the wings, out of sight of the stage. When he re-emerged, the bulk of the choral society had assembled. Deirdre, queen bee as always, was directing the singers to their various positions, altos here, bass baritones there. "And you," she said to Derek with a smile, "stand by me." Sebastian, the conductor, took up his position in front as the song sheets were handed out. This was not their first rehearsal, but Derek was still unsure of himself. The words were strange, something Deirdre explained by saying Alaric Daubeny had been an immigrant and had struggled to master English. He'd fled from Eastern Europe in the 30s. Derek had asked if he'd been persecuted by the Nazis or the Communists. "Oh, a bit of both," she'd replied. "Nobody in power liked him very much, apart from a small group of dedicated admirers, people on the margins, true visionaries." "Oh," Derek had said, unable to think of anything intelligent in reply. "Right, visionaries. Cool." As they did some warming-up exercises, Derek recalled how hard it had been to find anything online about the composer. Daubeny had been a youthful prodigy, writing his first symphony at 18 and winning plaudits from Stravinsky and Khachaturian, among others. But then things turned sour, amid rumours of a sordid and strange private life. He'd been forced out of his native country, first to Paris and then London. With war clouds looming, he'd migrated to Derek's obscure hometown, as if seeking complete nonentity. In exile, the composer had produced a second symphony, but it had only been performed once. One critic had described it as a cacophony of deranged shrieks and bangs, and not so much music as the audible manifestation of its creator's lunacy, which made a one-star review on Amazon seem positively kind. Then Daubeny had sunk into total obscurity, apparently making a living by writing advertising jingles and the odd film score. He'd been declared dead in 1967, but even here mystery prevailed, as no body had been found in his run-down apartment. So Daubeny had had no funeral, no gravestone, and apparently no legacy, or so it had seemed. Even the discovery of a hitherto unknown choral work just a couple of years earlier had barely generated a ripple of interest, but Deirdre's society had resolved to bring it to the public, and that was good enough for Derek. The first run-through of Summoning was ragged and hesitant. Daubeny's words were a mixture of stilted poetry and seemingly random outbursts. The meaning of phrases like "most Stygian benefactor" and "the night is wiser than the day" seemed to dance just outside Derek's understanding, taunting him. But on the second attempt they got it together, and Derek stopped worrying about meaning. Summoning was, he decided, aiming for something beyond the rational, as music often did. "That was lovely," Deirdre gushed when they'd finished. "Especially you, Derek. To think that you've been hiding your light under a bushel for all those years." "Thanks," he said, lamely. He looked at the expressions of the other singers, all smiling benignly. There was no hint of mockery or condescension, so far as he could see, yet he was so obviously the misfit, the middle-class nobody among these snobs. He wondered, as he often did, if they sneered at him when he wasn't around. But somehow he couldn't quite believe that. There was something, yes, an unspoken truth that they weren't passing on to him, but what it might be, he had no idea. "Now, Derek," Deirdre said, taking his arm, "I think you've worked hard enough. Let's adjourn to a nice little restaurant and have a rather late dinner." He felt a frisson of dread at the thought of the bill at what these people would consider a nice little restaurant, but Deirdre seemed to sense his concern and gave his arm a thrilling squeeze. "Now don't worry, the society is picking up the tab." This reminded Derek that he'd never actually been asked to pay for any kind of membership fee. He almost said so, then thought of his bank balance and kept quiet. The meal was wonderful, but something he ate must have disagreed with him, as Derek's dreams were troubled. First, the contorted figure vaguely seen reflected in the side of the bus followed him through labyrinthine corridors backstage at the concert hall. He fled through a fire exit, but instead of emerging into the open air, he found himself running onto the stage where the society awaited. Deirdre beckoned him over to an old-fashioned microphone that was shrouded in cobwebs. "You must sing for us, Derek," she said, leaning close, wetting her full lips with a pink, darting tongue. "Without you there can be no summoning." The others crowded around, and he felt himself shrinking until he was the size of a little boy in a gathering of adults, confused and afraid, his clothes still normal-sized and hanging loosely from his limbs. He got smaller, and Deirdre reached down and put him in the stroller that had suddenly appeared. "Poor baby," she crooned, "so young and tender." She smiled down at him, and her mouth was full of rusted, broken knives. He woke up sweating, then felt suddenly cold. He'd flung the covers onto the floor. The alarm would go off in a matter of minutes. He got up and got ready for work. The final rehearsal took place on Thursday night, the day before the concert. This time a musician joined them, a specialist hired from out of town. The newcomer, whose name Derek didn't catch, was a silent, inscrutable woman in late middle age. She spoke only to Sebastian and Deirdre, then took up her position in the orchestra pit. Surrounded on three sides by tiers of elaborate keyboards, she gazed up at Derek with alarming intensity. He felt the pressure of her gaze despite staring resolutely down at his song sheet. "It's nothing, really," he told himself. "These creative types are often eccentric." Before they warmed up, Derek asked Deirdre about ticket sales. "I dropped into that pub I mentioned," he explained. "The barmaid said she'd tried to book online, but the site crashed or something." "Oh dear," Deirdre replied, making a little moue of concern. "Well, she can always turn up at the door, you know. If you see her again, mention that. Why don't you?" They ran through the verses again, while the nameless musician looked on, eyes still fixed on Derek. They sang through the work, Derek stumbling slightly here and there. Nobody seemed to notice, though. "Excellent," said Sebastian. "Now our guest virtuoso will play the overture, and then we will perform for the first time with full musical accompaniment." The woman in the pit was undeniably talented, but as the piece progressed, Derek felt oppressed by the sheer complexity of it all. It seemed that Daubeny had written a piece that used literally every single playable note. The tortured interplay of rhythm and melody was music, he supposed, but only just. And then, as the choral section approached, the woman reached up to the smallest of her keyboards. When she struck the keys, all of which were black, Derek heard nothing. But he felt the impact of the sound emanating from the strange device. A vibration passed through his body and seemed to shake his guts and bones and compress his skull. "Oh, God!" he blurted out. "Now, Derek," Deirdre said with a hint of genuine anger, let's not blaspheme." The way she corrected herself was odd, but he was too uncomfortable to wonder why. He still had to do his bit. The choral society began to sing, and Derek forced himself to ignore the disturbing effects of the infrasound notes. And soon, as if by magic, he didn't need to try any more. After the shaky run-through, the words came naturally now, the bizarre poetry fitting the music perfectly. In a few minutes Derek was carried away by the intensity of the composer's vision. It was not nice, perhaps even sinister, but it had undeniable power. Daubeny's last and perhaps greatest work conjured up images in Derek's mind. He saw the composer, a wrinkled and emaciated figure wrapped in an overcoat. Snow was heaped high on the window ledge of his dim-lit apartment. Daubeny was hunched over a table littered with papers, his back to Derek, evidently correcting a composition. There were deletions, additions. The composer hunched over, coughing, and ink spattered the corner of one sheet. Then, suddenly, he twisted around to stare at Derek. Something about the contorted figure, the deep-set eyes, the aura of the man, reminded Derek of his odd experience just after leaving the pub. They were almost at the end of the piece. Strange incantations came thick and fast. Dark gods were invoked, strange powers exploited. The unheard power of the infrasound increased, and the pressure on Derek's brain returned. He was shaking, his knees weak, as if life energy were being drained from him. Or was this a reaction to some new kind of vitality flooding into him? Where had that idea come from? He made himself focus on the words before he could let Deirdre down. They reached the last line, the music rising to a clangorous climax before fading to allow the human voice, the final word. "I am the sacrifice," Derek sang. "Through me he will return." And only his voice sounded through the auditorium. The others had stopped, along with the musician. He goggled at Deirdre, wondering if he'd made some kind of faux pas. "No," she said, seeing his confusion. "You're not mistaken, Derek. You are indeed the sacrifice. Through you he will return." She smiled, and he remembered his nightmare. Her teeth were perfect, in no way horrific, but the bright smile was not for him. It never had been. He knew that now. The others had formed a semicircle, faces expectant, as another wave of energy flooded through Derek. "I don't understand," he croaked. What happened?" "This was the real performance, Derek," Deirdre said indulgently, a grown-up humouring a slow-witted child. "There are no tickets. I just invented something to keep you busy, make you feel needed. All we needed was the right place, the right time, and the right person. It was no coincidence that you were placed there at the office, under my nose. It was ordained, and it was so easy to get you to join our little group. You're one of those sad, hopeless men who are satisfied with very little, so eager to please. And you do please me. You please all of us, and you please the Master." Derek might have been angry if he hadn't been so hurt. He wanted to storm out of the building, but the unnatural power coursing through him interfered with his sense of balance. He clutched at the nearest microphone stand to stay upright. "He looks nothing like the Master," remarked Sebastian. "But you did choose wisely, Deirdre. I see that now." "Appearances aren't everything," Deirdre observed with clinical detachment. "He looks nothing like the Master now, but see, already the change begins." What do you—" said Derek. He couldn't finish the question. A sudden spasm of pain shot through his limbs, as if his arms and legs were being stretched on a rack. He screamed and fell to his knees as his spine cracked and the bones of his face and skull shifted under the skin. His body was being torn apart or remade. And with the pain came knowledge, memories, feelings. He recalled acts of monstrous cruelty and perversion, the quest for ever greater power, the need to defy death to bring his work to fruition. Derek moaned in pain and confusion. But it was not the memories of Alaric Daubeny that finally wiped away the last traces of his personality, along with his face. The harmless, lonely little man was washed away by a flood of monstrous creativity, a deluge of ideas. Alaric Daubeny, thwarted in his first life, would use his second to perfect his music and employ new methods to bring it to the world. Music of a kind never heard before. Wild, discordant music that would herald the coming age of darkness, fire, and tribulation.